I was just wondering whether it was going to quiet down on its own accord, and the answer is no. So I have the answer to the first question I was going to ask, which is everybody having a good time tonight? We always gather around December 5th, but we go with what the calendar gives us, and this event always takes place on the Thursday night of the days in which the Senate is meeting, so it doesn't always fall spot on December 5th. So I get to say tonight that it was 248 years ago tonight, maybe 248 years ago right this minute, that the story that you all know well of 500 graduates of the College of William and Mary gathered in the Apollo Room of the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia, and they created something new under the sun. A society dedicated to the arts and sciences, what they would call literature, and dedicated to morality, and dedicated to friendship. They planted seeds that night that ultimately would find fertile soil all across the nation. Today on 293 campuses and an astonishing range of campuses, big, small, public, private, sectarian, non-sectarian. And they committed themselves to a motto that maybe we know too well, so we forget sometimes to think what the words mean. What they committed themselves to that night was that in times of peace and in times of turmoil, in times of ease and in times of stress, that they would turn to the love of learning as their guide, or as I like to say, the pilot of their lives. It is a mission that has never been more relevant, and it inspires us still. Tonight, we don't ignore the challenges that face our nation and our world, but we choose to celebrate as we look back on 248 years of our history and anticipate our semi-quincentennial. You just wanted to hear me say semi-quincentennial, be honest. In just 2 years' time. We celebrate here in Washington, D.C. tonight, and a year from tonight, we will celebrate in Williamsburg, Virginia, where it all began. And 2 years from tonight, and I hear my grandmother's voice powerfully saying, don't forget to say God willing. Boy, the older I get, the smarter the old lady seems, I have to tell you. 2 years from tonight, we will gather here in Washington, D.C. for a gala to celebrate our 250th birthday, 250th anniversary. And I not only hope you will all be there, let's call it what it is. I expect you all to be there. So tonight we celebrate, and when we celebrate, as Esther said earlier, we at Phi Beta Kappa, we celebrate with books. I am reminded of what the late Hilary Mantel said about books. She said, books are not there to allow you to escape, but to give you information about the human condition, which is a thing you cannot escape. You find out the use of books when you are very young, she wrote. History, biography, and novels in particular lend you experience that is not yet your own. They are, and I love this phrase, they are an advance paid on life. They hand you different scripts to try, she wrote. They rehearse you. If you want entertainment, roll dice. Then you maintain your happy-go-lucky innocence. Books teach you that actions have consequences, and they help you grow up. It is now my great pleasure to present the winners of the 2024 Phi Beta Kappa Book Awards, books that help us grow up, books that help us not escape the human condition, far from it, books that help us understand the human condition, face the human condition, indeed celebrate the human condition. As is our custom, each award will be presented in the order of the establishment of the award, and after the presentation of each, We will have the opportunity to hear from each winner. Then we will have a discussion with the authors on stage, and I just have to say that Esther has raised the bar so high that my goal is to disappoint you as little as possible. Then the discussion will be recorded and taped and edited for an upcoming episode of my podcast, Key Conversations with Phi Beta Kappa. Those of you who listen to podcasts, we have two, Smarty Pants. My colleagues at the American Scholar have the Smarty Pants podcast, of which I am an avid listener. And I encourage you to get Smarty Pants and download it and listen. And if while you happen to be wherever you get your podcasts, you happen to find Key Conversations with Phi Beta Kappa, I would welcome your listening as well. Let me first express several words of appreciation. First, I would like to thank the members of the Phi Beta Kappa Book Award selection committees for their time, thoughtful reading, and ultimately their book selections. As with so much that we do at Phi Beta Kappa, it would simply not be possible without the commitment of our dedicated volunteers. When I thank our volunteers, when I travel to our 293 chapters, I tell them I thank you not just because it is the polite thing to do, although I hope it is that as well. It's because you are my business model. We will induct 20,000 students this year. We will have events all over the country. We have the long list and the short list of books and these books selected. And those of us who are privileged to work full-time for the Phi Beta Kappa Society could not possibly do that on our own. So you are volunteers in the room, and those for whom you stand in tonight are our business model. I would also like to thank the members of the Secretary Circle who are present. Your generous support makes our work possible today and every day. Last but not least, that's not right. Last and most, I would like to take a moment of personal privilege and thank my colleagues on the Phi Beta Kappa staff and ask them if they would be good enough to stand to be recognized. Thank you all for what you do for our shared mission and our shared work. We begin with the Christian Gauss Award. The Christian Gauss Award is the oldest of our three Phi Beta Kappa Book Awards. It was established by the Phi Beta Kappa Senate in 1950 to recognize outstanding books in the field of literary scholarship or criticism. The award is named for the late Christian Gauss, the distinguished Princeton University scholar, teacher, and dean who served for many years as a member of the Phi Beta Kappa Senate and was one of Esther's predecessors as the president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award is The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts, the True Story of the Bondwoman's Narrative by Gregg Hecimovich, published by Echo. Sometimes authors who are famous in their own times are lost to history. Who shall we malign? Think of Sir Walter Scott. But other times, precisely the opposite happens, and fame and notoriety come along long after a writer's lifetime. So it was for Hannah Bond Crafts, who in 1857 escaped enslavement on a North Carolina plantation and fled to a farm in New York. In hiding, she worked on a manuscript that over a century and a half later in 2002 would be published to acclaim as the Bondwoman's Narrative. And yet, even then, her identity remained unknown until Gregg Hecimovich unraveled the mystery of the author's name. The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts tells her riveting story. Hannah Crafts was not only the first known Black woman to compose a novel, but also an extraordinarily gifted artist who honed her literary skills in direct opposition to a system designed to deny her every measure of humanity. Think of it as the courage of literacy. After escaping to New York, she forged a new identity as Hannah Crafts to make sense of a life fractured by slavery and reconstructed by literature. Gregg Hecimovich is a Hutchins Family Fellow at Harvard University and Professor of English at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. He received his PhD in English from Vanderbilt University, has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and elsewhere. He lives in Cambridge and Greenville with his wife and 2 children. It is my great pleasure and honor to present the 2024 Christian Gauss Award to Dr. Gregg Hecimovich. Let's do this. If he doesn't make this picture, this never happened, you see.
Thank you so much. I am so grateful to this organization and everyone who gathered here tonight. I am just blown away with the finalists for this award. For the other awards, I've read Jeremy and Emily's books, which we're going to have this discussion. They just blew me away. It was just a pleasure to read your work. Tonight, I want to start by what I always do when I talk about Hannah Crafts is I recognize the descendant communities who I spent 20 years writing this book, and nearly 10 of them spending an extraordinary amount of time in small communities in Eastern North Carolina where the record and history of Hannah Bond was preserved by people in those communities. It wasn't in libraries, it was in those communities where that record was. And it took many years of friendship and connection with those communities. So I want to name just some of them, and they're in the book. Albert Bishop, Walter Cray, Marva Dickinson, Kalisa Hickerson, Joanna Reed, Alvin Smallwood, Benjamin Speller, Isabel Stewart, Wendell White. Those are descendants of enslaved people who shared generously that history. There were also descendants of enslavers who invited me into their homes, and I'll just name a few of them. Mac and Clara Bell, Elizabeth Wheeler Cooper, Reverend Joseph Cooper, and others. Hilary Mantel, who we just heard from, helped me see the whole story of Hannah Craft's life. And I'm going to quote Hilary Mantel again here. This is the epigraph to the book. Autobiographies display the triumph of experience, but novels are acts of hope. She wrote that when she did her review of the Bondwoman's narrative, when this novel was published and it became a bestseller. And I didn't know it at the time, but as I researched this book over all those years, leave it to a novelist, an artist, to really see into the heart of the book. Hannah Crafts was born as Hannah Bond. She was born out of rape of her mother. And she had this very challenging life, but she wrote a novel that soars with beauty, love, comedy, and joy coming from extraordinary trauma. And one of the things that's beautiful with all of us who are book lovers, books are our friends. And we live in them and with them, and they teach us all the time. When you return to a book that you've read, maybe when you were 18 and you return to it again, it's still speaking to you and you're bringing new knowledge to it. As a writer, Hannah Crafts has been my friend for over 20 years. I've known Hannah longer than I've known my wife, who is in the audience, not as long as my identical twin, who was there at the very moment. If you know science, zygote, anyway. What I want to, as I wrote Hannah Craft's story, I'll just give one example and then one moment that I want to sum up. Hannah Crafts, while she was enslaved, was forced to go to blackface minstrels. And in my research, I discovered that the Wheeler family who owned her loved this blackface minstrel that was a riff on Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in that blackface minstrel, she was forced to sit in the balcony and watch white people blacken their face with cork and make fun of enslaved people. In her extraordinary novel, she flips the script and writes a scene where she puts a smelling bottle under Mrs. Wheeler after applying white powder to her face, and Mrs. Wheeler's face turns black, and she goes and begs for a government appointment. That doesn't actually happen in real life. That happens in the mind and genius of a comic artist. The first African-American woman who ever wrote a novel. And as I was researching and writing her life, I didn't know what the rest of her story would be. And I'm so happy to share that she lived a joyful, happy life as an artist kin who creates joy out of difficulty. So this is the one passage. I wrote the whole book, discovered her life, and this is the key for me. Despite her condition in bondage, Crafts wrote her novel for the same reasons many people write novels and read them. She yearned to transcend her world by living intimately within a story she could help form. And in many ways, the reimagined journey to freedom she portrays in the Bondwoman's narrative helped her realize the life she came to possess. She started writing the novel on paper she stole from her enslaver. She was imagining a world of freedom, joy, and love and comedy against the horrors of slavery. And this is exactly the world she wrote and then reached. And it's just been a great joy and honor of my life to have this friendship with Hannah Crafts. And I hope you'll encounter her novel, The Bondwoman's Narrative, and spend some time with her in the life and times of Hannah Crafts. Thank you.
If you want to know how the connections emerge over the course of the night, we didn't plan that with Hilary Mantel. The thing reveals itself, right? And in fact, at dinner last night, Ron Crutcher and I were talking about what? Talking about the minstrel shows based on Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's only one story, brother. We just keep telling it in different places. The Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science was established in 1959 to encourage literate and scholarly interpretation of the physical and biological sciences and mathematics. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science is Blight, Fungi and the Coming Pandemic by Emily Monosson, published by W.W. Norton and Company. We live in a time where the word pandemic conjures up not just images of a distant past, but an all too recent past, a present, and we acknowledge with no small anxiety, possibly a future. But as Emily Monosson has taught us in all of her work, and especially in her most recent book, what Francis Bacon taught us half a millennia ago has never been more true. Knowledge is, in fact, power. Yes, fungi are everywhere. And although most are harmless or even helpful, a few are killers. Collectively, infectious fungi are the most devastating agents of disease on Earth, and a fungus that can persist in the environment without its host is here to stay. Monosson documents how trade, travel, and a changing climate are making us all more vulnerable to invasion. Populations of bats, frogs, and salamanders face extinction. In the Northwest, America's beloved national parks are covered with the spindly corpses of white bark pines. Food crops are under siege, threatening our coffee, bananas, and wheat. More broadly, our global food security. Drug-resistant and resilient strains can infect hospital patients and those with weakened immune systems. But knowledge is power, and Blight is a powerful book. Prevention is not impossible. Delving into case studies at once fascinating, sobering, and yes, hopeful, Blight serves as a wake-up call, a reminder of the delicate interconnectedness of the natural world and a lesson in seeing life on our planet with renewed humility and awe. Emily Monosson is the author of Natural Defense, Unnatural Selection, and Evolution in a Toxic World. She is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She lives in Montague, Massachusetts. It is a great pleasure to present the 2024 Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science to Dr. Emily Monosson.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm really honored to be here. I can't believe I'm here, actually. And this has been a really nice evening so far, so thank you all. I want to thank the Phi Beta Kappa Society and Fred and the staff. Again, I want to thank those who read all of these books. I know it's not an easy task. I've done it before. And not only are you reading a whole lot of books, but there isn't much difference often between a book that wins and one that does not. There are a few things that might have helped Blight gain some recognition. One is the timing, coming out following a viral pandemic. I was about 6 months in when COVID hit and asked my editor if I should just stop writing, because who's going to want to read a book about a fungal pandemic after we just got over a viral pandemic? But probably more importantly was an HBO show, The Last of Us, about a fungus that turns people into zombies, which was actually a really good show. Coming out with another season. That show has done more to raise awareness about fungal pathogens than I think even the World Health Organization. It's really kind of remarkable about what popular culture can do. When we think about fungi, we might typically think about mushrooms or fungi in the forest ecosystem or in our guts, where we have fungi mixing with our bacteria and our other microbes. The fungal kingdom is large and amazingly diverse, like Brad just said, and only a small proportion of all fungi cause disease. And I often say that even those fungi aren't bad. They're just trying to survive. And unfortunately, they find hosts that get really sick when they do. By training, I am not a mycologist, epidemiologist, physician, ag scientist, and a lot of other fields this book touches upon. I'm just a scientist who writes. And so I'm grateful for the many scientists who are those things and who made themselves available for an interview and all the follow-up email questions and who trusted me with their words. Many of those I spoke with entered their field full of hope and wonder, thinking they might study ancient pines or frogs or bats, only to study instead their demise. All have now dedicated their work towards saving these animals or trees or crops and understanding the fungi that threaten them. I also want to thank my editor, W.W. Norton, for taking a chance on this topic and on me as a writer. And I would like to thank my husband, Ben, who's over there, who has heard every word of this book multiple times in multiple different orders at just about any time of the day during just about any activity. Thank you for your support over the years. I don't know if I would have made it through writing books if not for you. And finally, it is really an honor to be here with Gregg, whose book I recently read and thought was fascinating, and Jeremy, whose book I gave to my father-in-law last Christmas as a gift, feeling pretty good about finding a gem that would speak to his interest in music and in history. So thank you again. It's really an honor to be here.
The Ralph Waldo Emerson Award was established in 1960 to recognize studies that contribute significantly to historical, philosophical, or religious interpretations of the human condition. The winner of the Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award is Time's Echo, The Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance by Jeremy Eichler, published by Alfred A. Knopf. In 1973, the English poet Arthur O'Shaughnessy wrote in his poem Ode, "We are the music makers and we are the dreamers of dreams." Time's Echo is a moving account of how the music makers can bear witness to history and carry forward the haunting memory of war. Jeremy Eichler has shown us that music is one of our most significant cultural archives. We meet four towering composers, Richard Strauss, Arnold Schoenberg, Dmitri Shostakovich, and Benjamin Britten, who lived through the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and later transformed their experiences into transcendent works of music, scores that echo lost time. Summoning the supporting testimony of writers, poets, philosophers, musicians, and everyday citizens, Eichler reveals how the essence of an entire epic has been inscribed in these sounds and stories, and as any great work of history, it speaks to us of a past that illuminates our presence. To take but one example, and if I may tonight, it's a personal one. I first performed Britain's War Requiem as an undergraduate in the fall of 1973. That was during the last days of the Vietnam War. The War Requiem is a piece that, as its libretto, borrows First World War poetry, its music written in the shadow of the Second World War to be performed in the bombed out remains of the Coventry Cathedral. And we were performing it in the waning days of the Vietnam War. Past and present fused and shone a bright and inspiring light on the future. As of this year, Jeremy Eichler holds the newly created professorship in music, history, and public humanities at Tufts University. Previously, he served for 18 years as classical music critic of the Boston Globe, where he covered local, national, and international events, earning multiple Pulitzer Prize nominations and an ASCAP Dean's Taylor Award for Distinguished Music Criticism. During the 2024-25 season, he also serves as the London Philharmonic Orchestra's inaugural writer-in-residence. That is a good gig, right? It is now my great pleasure to present the 2024 Ralph Waldo Emerson Award to Dr. Jeremy Eichler.
Thank you so much to Secretary Fred Lawrence, to the Phi Beta Kappa leadership and staff, so many of whom are here today, to the jury members, some of whom are here today, who read so many books. I cannot imagine, and to all of you for coming. Times Echo, I'm not quite done with my thank yous. Times Echo was a labor of love, really a labor of heart and mind for a full decade of my life. And it's really an incredible honor to receive the recognition of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award. I would also be remiss not to acknowledge the presence of two people who were intimately involved with the journey of the book who are also here tonight. One is an old and dear friend, Sarah Gershman, who any writer will tell you we require a lot of kind of surround support, and Sarah has been a dear and cherished friend for double the length of time it took to write this book. So thank you, Sarah. And thank you to my wife, Karen Namer, who is also here today. Karen was with me at every stage of the vicissitudes of this book, and there were many ups and many downs. She shouldered endless parenting responsibilities while I was away at various archives. And she also read every single word, as we've heard before, that this forget about the publishing editor, the editors at the houses. It's all the editors that are your spouses that are really the key behind any author worth his or her salt. Thank you to Karen, as I wrote in the book, her wisdom and her sparkle and her support has really made all of this possible. When I first learned that the book was even in consideration for the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize, I was amazed and gratified, and I immediately went to learn more about the prize. And with a few clicks, one can pull up a list of the previous winners. I was astonished, humbled, delighted to see so many books that I knew and recognized going back, I think, over 60 years. Books I had known and deeply admired, books from which I've learned so much over the years. Interestingly, I also quickly noted almost all of them were drawn from various humanities disciplines, including history, philosophy, and religion, and related fields of anthropology and social sciences. I noted quickly that among the books selected as winners, one per year dating back again, something like 6 decades, there was not a single title focusing on music. Surely, I thought this meant that this year's prize would probably go in another direction. But it also, all of this added to, of course, my sense of delight, appreciation, and surprise when the word came from Fred that, in fact, Times Echo had been chosen for this year's award. It does also kind of beg an interesting question. Why should music have not been represented on this list before of titles in the humanities? I think, in a way, my theory is that it may speak to a broader way in which the arts have come to be siloed off, even from the humanities. A division, I think, that works really to the detriment of both sides. In the case of classical music, we tend to associate this art form really perhaps with the domain of aesthetic entertainment. We're there to have an enjoyable night at the concert hall or the opera, perhaps even on the best night, some kind of spiritual uplift from a concert that's been really meaningful. But there's even more, or there can be even more going on when we listen. Exploring that more, that even more, probing music's connection to history and memory and place. In short, bridging the gap between the arts and the humanities was actually very consciously something that I sought to do when I wrote Time's Echo. The book makes the case that it's not just we who remember music, but music that remembers us as a society, that it's a kind of archive of our culture's memory, that it's capable of crystallizing these wordless truths from these earlier eras and carrying them forward, especially when we take the time to learn about the cultures that are being remembered and can be accessed again through the music. All of this allows us then to transform our own experiences as listeners, hearing so much more, if you will, resonating between the notes. Thank you again so much to the Society for continuing to uphold the value of books that in their approach attempt to reach at the same time both deeply but also widely. Thank you for recognizing Time's Echo, and thank you for expanding the Emerson Award family to include an art form that Ralph Waldo Emerson himself once referred to as a kind of refuge or asylum. Music, he wrote, takes us out of the actual and whispers to us dim secrets that startle our wonder as to who we are. I'll add who we are as individuals, but also as a collective, as a society. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get to work. I was thinking in each of these books, as I had the pleasure of reading through them, of something that Barbara Tuchman says near the end of her introduction to The Proud Tower, her, if you will, group biography, European biography of the decades before the First World War. Tuchman, as each of you, labored long and hard in these vineyards, many interviews, much research, much archival work. And she says at the end of the introduction that she is consumed at the end of her work with all of the faces of those who contributed to it, pressing to get into the book. They haunt me now, she says. So I want to ask each of you a little bit about those faces, maybe not haunting you, but inspiring you, that were part of this journey. Gregg, you did extraordinary work with the Bondwoman's narrative, but you're not the first one to pick up this text. You inherited, as it were, and as you and Skip Gates says in his generous foreword, I have to add, Skip Gates, a Phi Beta Kappa member who we were able to honor this summer with a Distinguished Service to the Humanities Award. But both of you talk about the fact that there will be more birth records, marriage records, death records that will be found, and more work will be done. So how did you see yourself in this sort of continuum of people working on Hannah Bond crafts?
Yeah, I love this image of this line of people, a crowd of people who are pressing against the glass that a writer is containing in two covers of a book. The work we do, I think of this all the time. Over in the sciences, there'll be a lab, a good, important question, and there's groups of people collaborating to discover new things. This is exactly what we do in the humanities. It's not a person who escapes into a cubicle and creates a monograph. So in this story, Hannah Crafts, who left this manuscript, left a manuscript, a holograph manuscript. We don't have that for anyone else in this period. Particularly, you know, Frederick Douglass is all typed out. It's gone through abolitionist editorial apparatus. We have this unique voice of Hannah Crafts in the manuscript that Dr. Gates recovered. And the manuscript record itself is a number of people pressing together to advance the story that she tells. When I began writing this book, I spoke with Dr. Gates. He's just been amazing. He's the most amazing, extraordinary man I've ever met. I love that man. He's a genius and generous. When he was advising me on writing the book, he told me, keep it narrow, write on just Hannah Crafts. And I couldn't do that. And I felt like you did. There's all these other stories that surrounded Hannah Crafts' context in her life. All these other figures who were her friends who told her their stories. So when she wrote her novel, she didn't write an autobiography. She wrote an autobiographical novel. So it was, for me, the journey of engaging that story took me into realms in the scholarly world. It took me into realms in the local history. It took me into the communities that were the life force of the book. So the image of these many people are in this story. And when I was just teaching some of this history to my students, and there's a list of the characters who are a part of this novel, there's this rich history that forms any creative work. And for me, as a writer, developing that history, and when I read these other works that we're discussing, I saw the same thing. The life force behind the art that we're uncovering is what we're trying to orchestrate as writers to bring back more fully and to get to the meaning of the work.
So, Emily, let's talk about the life force in Blight. It clearly has your voice, and yet you draw on, I lost count, scores of scientists and their work and their stories. So how did you see yourself as in dialogue with them, and that dialogue then emerging into the manuscript and into the page and through you to us?
And more.
Yeah, I got to 25 and I said, yep, there are more. And that's where I stopped counting.
I think I felt like I was just giving them an opportunity to speak to a broader audience than publishing. I'm thinking that they're publishing their scientific papers. They're working in a field that they want the general public and more people to know about. Sometimes there are news articles written about stuff, but then it goes away. So I felt like this was an opportunity to take all of their voices and sort of put them forward in a way that maybe other people would read and hear their story. And also to know that each topic that they're studying isn't just in isolation, that they're all connected from humans to crops. And that was one of the things that I wanted to say. And I think the difficult thing is the voices that I didn't include. So all the people that I did interview, and then I didn't include them. And that was one of the harder things.
That's tough when space is pressed up against the glass, right? That feel.
Yeah. So there were plenty, and I still struggle with that, with how do you interview someone and talk to them and spend time, and then it just doesn't fit in, or it's under there, but it's not up here. So.
Jeremy, your work is one of music criticism, of philosophy, of history, but at least on some level, it's also a tetralogy biography, right, of these four individuals. And I wonder, what was your relationship with Britten, with Shostakovich, with Schoenberg, with Strauss before starting Time's Echo, and how did that relationship change over the course of the project?
Yeah. I would say that I in different ways had a relationship ranging from affection to love to, in some sense, in some moments with Strauss, who I already knew was the most politically complicated. Mm-hmm. There was a real enjoyment of his music, but also knowing that I was going to have to grapple with some really complicated historical life. It turned out that they all had very complicated historical lives, and that and this was something that I really wanted to to the extent that it was a group biography, I wanted to really show them warts and all, to really take them down from the pedestals that they've sometimes occupied, and really invite readers just to see the contours of their personalities in every dimension, the fullness of it. I will also say, another figure whose work I quote often in the book is the German Jewish philosopher and critic Walter Benjamin, whose writing on memory and the philosophy of history was really influential for me at different points. Just this summer, I had the opportunity to visit a monument that was built on the coast. He committed suicide fleeing Nazi Germany. He was turned back at the French-Spanish border and took his own life near the end of the Nazi regime. There is a monument that's built into a gorgeous cliff in Spain's Costa Brava near the town of Portbou, and a monument to Benjamin. It takes the form of a staircase, a bronze staircase that bisects the cliff, and you enter from the very top of the cliff, and it's angled down. You walk down lower and lower and lower, and you see in front of you just the sea in this beautiful, beautiful cerulean color, just kind of beckoning. It's really kind of an image of freedom that the monument clearly wants us to feel, that Benjamin himself saw sort of glittering there just out of reach. And just as in his experience, your path towards freedom is blocked. You arrive, as you're walking down in the monument, you arrive at a glass screen onto which is etched one sentence from his philosophy, his theses on the philosophy of history. It says, and it gave me, the whole thing was extraordinary. This sentence gave me a lot of pause. I was there to honor Benjamin, this renowned writer and critic. And the sentence that's been put into this glass was that it is in fact easier to remember the memory of the renowned than it is to recall the memory of the anonymous. Historical reconstruction should be devoted to the memory of the anonymous. And for me, without having seen that sentence previously, that was also a guiding light for me. There are these towering figures whose biographies are presented in the book, but there's also a lot of really careful attention paid to the people that you've never heard of, that were all around them, and whose stories in some very basic way bore the truth of that era. It's sometimes more clearly than the lives of these celebrity composers. So it was really important for me to tell their stories as well.
Now, when I spoke to each of the three of you, there are parts of this job that I like, and there are parts of this job that are just great. And there's nothing better than making these 3 phone calls, I have to tell you. And as the 3 authors know, I don't keep you on the hook, and sort of say that, well, it was a hard decision, and well, it was I start by telling you that you won. And then I tell you that we're going to have this discussion and then look for a common thread through it. And of course, Esther promises that's what I'm going to do. And I think I found one that I want to try out on you and ask you to reflect. And I think the common thread is redemption. So, Emily, let me start with you. As everybody is thinking, Blight, a book about fungi, and Lawrence is going to find redemption. Well, I found redemption because you wrote redemption. Here's what you wrote. You wrote, some species will need our help to survive, and we will have to decide as a society how far we are willing to go to save a tree or a staple crop. In other words, it's possible. It's in our control. And that's not a pessimistic line. It's out of our control. An optimistic line is not it's solved, but it's in our control. And later you say, if we choose to act on our hope, we have some motivation to right our wrongs. So I'm not proposing this as a promise of redemption, but is it fair to say that your book in part is a call to action to redeem that which is broken?
I'm going to be really brutally honest here. So it is, but I feel that also to write a book like that, writing the first whatever chapters, that was probably the last chapter, was easy. And then you have to have a chapter on hope. I could have easily not had a chapter on hope because that's the hard part to write. And sometimes when I do that, I'm like, can an individual really do that, or is it a society? I mean, to be honest, can individuals really, how much can we do when it comes to that? Saving species, whatever. So anyway, that's, yes, it is there, but I felt like I had to really search for it.
Which we all do. And we may be in a time where the search for redemption is what we need to do. Jeremy, maybe in your case, it's the easiest case, or maybe I just see it there. I was struck by the fact that Britton, in his request, his program for the premiere of War Requiem, requested the audience not to applaud. He wanted them to be in the silence of the moment. And there is that extraordinary moment at the end of the last Requiem Aeternam Dona Eis Domine, and it fades to silence, and it's just silence. Is there redemption to be found in the music about a calamitous war and the Holocaust?
Why don't you ask me an easy question?
I didn't promise you they would be easy. I promised I would look for a common thread.
I think that part of me resists the idea or part of me is cautious about the question of whether, there is this ethical question of, with memory, all kinds of memory art, should the victims' memories, is there something problematic about aestheticizing their memories even as we commemorate them? Is that something, is to aestheticize their deaths through art somehow to violate their memories? And so I guess I would come at the question of redemption a little bit, or I came at the question of redemption a little bit differently in writing the book. I think one of the things that I felt, first of all, that was important to do was actually, if there is redemption to be found, perhaps it's actually in the telling of some of these stories itself, in the giving of names to the nameless, in the recreation of not just how various actors died, but also how they lived. And one of the quotes that I have before, one of the earlier, the book is about the Second World War and the Holocaust as these incredible ruptures, not just a rupture of course, for not just really ruptures that targeted any particular ethnic minorities, but ruptures for us as a society, as a species, a rupture. I quote, I have a quote that it was a rupture in the kind of solidarity, that the core solidarity at the most basic level that we feel between anyone who wears a human face. And so, but I didn't want to start my story with the end, if you will. And so the story begins actually 200 years earlier. I have a quote from Thomas Mann who says that we shouldn't remember stories only by virtue of their ending. Their beginnings and their middles also have a dignity and have a meaning that is also part of the process of redeeming them, honoring that not just the death, but also the life. The last part of it I wanted to say was just that it was also about honoring these ideals that were so discredited by the Second World War and the Holocaust in some ways, these ideals, this humanistic vision about that the arts, that the humanities, the liberal arts, if you will, can actually contribute to who we are as human beings. They can kind of form a form of personal education of the spirit, of the soul, of the mind. And that this was an idea, that humanism has its own kind of intrinsic value and worth. This was a book that also tried to salvage those kinds of sparks of hope that were placed in that tradition, even if those sparks themselves had been buried by the rubble of history.
And Gregg, maybe yours is actually the easiest case for redemption, putting a name on a book that didn't have a name on it, and yet you haven't finished the work, right? The work goes on. So is it a partial redemption, or how do you see it as a redemptive narrative?
I do, and I think it fits very much with what Jeremy was talking about, the anonymous. So before I started this book, when I went to Wheeler House, the house preserved by the family who owned the novelist, when I would go there, there was nothing, this isn't uncommon, but there's nothing said. There was no record kept of the people who were enslaved. The Wheeler family said that they manumitted their slaves and sent them to Liberia. It was a lie. People in the community knew it was a lie. Black people in the community knew it was a lie, but it was a lie everybody in that community was willing to live. This novel is a redemptive spark of the anonymous voice brought into art, right? Into a novel. When I wrote the novel, it wasn't just Hannah Crafts, it was the other enslaved people, the 26 people who were sold from Wheeler House and sent to New Orleans, almost none of them traceable, who created the profit that allowed that house to stand still. Boosters in the community and boosters in the state of North Carolina lovingly recreated the property of the drapes, the carpets, the furnishings, nothing about the people. Those people's story is the most joyful and powerful model we have for dealing with horror, trauma, cruelty, and to not follow the light of that story is to impoverish everyone. So somewhere down in Florida, the Bondwoman's narrative is now not allowed to be taught in some school. And that doesn't scare me. That genie's never going back in that bottle. I'm following a bunch of other scholars who were telling that story. The story that a number of just trailblazing African-American women historians, Annette Gordon Reed's always been a guiding star for me. That is our history. It's our most joyful, redemptive, powerful toolbox for facing hatred, racism, classism, the potential extinction of human beings. We don't have to go that route. And we're seeing that. And I felt so strongly in my long journey with Hannah showing me the way and those communities who have those stories. So I feel very strongly the redemptive part of what history and art can provide, specifically through the genius of this one particular woman whose story was preserved. And it was preserved because of Black people. It was preserved because of Henry Louis Gates Jr. It was preserved because Dorothy Porter Wesley, the greatest librarian of the 20th century, got a hold of that from Emily Driscoll, who was a white book dealer who got a hold from it from Hannah Craft's stepson, who preserved that manuscript, and it went into the property of his employers, a white family who were plumbers that he lived with. This is a story of joy, of redemption.
So before we end, I want to ask one last question to each of you. And it's a question that is prompted by something I do at Phi Beta Kappa induction ceremonies. I tell the room full of inductees that I know many things about them by the fact, just by dint of the fact they're about to be inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. I know that they've gone to a very fine school for which they should certainly be proud. They got in there. I know they challenged themselves, the hardest program, and that they did well and succeeded at the highest level, for which they should be very proud. And I also know that they've been blessed, for which you can't be proud. You can only be grateful and humble and responsible. Somebody said the right word at the right time. Somebody played a role, turned the key, as we like to say at Phi Beta Kappa, and changed their life. And I have to tell you, every time I do this, I look around the room and I see I can see it in their eyes. I can see who's doing it. They're picturing somebody. So I've drawn this out long enough to give you each a chance to think of the person you want to talk about. And Jeremy, it's only fair to start with you since you haven't gone first yet. I wonder, is there somebody who said the right word at the right time, who changed the path, who led you think I could be a historian, I could be a music critic, or who made the path possible as you look back on
I think there were many people that I really respond. I'm one of the people like your inductees who was nodding as you were saying that, at least on the inside, because for sure none of us, all of us, I think, feel really powerfully that we're standing on the shoulders of so many people who came before. In terms of my craft as a writer and just my belief that that was something, that words were a medium through which I could communicate something that was important, at least to me, if to no one else, I'd like to just say a word of credit to my 11th grade English teacher.
I just have to tell you, this kind of answer happens more often than not.
Yeah. No, her name is Marilyn Hubbard. She was also a pianist, though I didn't realize that, I think, till later in life. And the first thing she did actually was kind of call me over after I had done my first assignment of the term, and actually give me a lot of criticism. I had been kind of coasting through at that point because I had a certain facility with putting words together in a sentence, but no one had really done me the courtesy or really given me the gift, even you could say the blessing, of seeing beyond what I was putting on the page to realize that there could be much more in that I could develop as a writer. She helped me see that. She helped show me how to do that. And if she hadn't made that little micro moment of intervention and of sort of setting a standard or setting a bar for me myself to then pursue, who knows what would have happened beyond that. So thank you. Yeah.
The reason I resonated with that is my mother was somebody's 11th grade English teacher. She taught high school English for 40 years. And as I used to tell her, I like to think that as a law professor, I've made a difference in my students' lives. She changed people's lives, lots of them. And that's different. That's that story.
Yeah.
Emily?
I think I would say my dad. So for many years, my dad, I was a toxicologist, I studied PCBs and fish. And many years, my dad was like, you should write an editorial. You should write this. You should write that. Stuff that's out there. And I'm like, Dad, scientists don't do that. I said, I'm writing papers and I'm not writing that and I can't write that. But my dad is somebody who, he went to MIT and he flunked English twice. And then he started writing in his business and had a column. And he just wrote in a very natural way. And so I think that combination, many years, so I didn't write for many years. And then I finally thought, maybe, and I think I didn't because he told me to.
You wouldn't be the first person with that story.
Yeah. So luckily, he was still alive when I wrote my first book, which I think he couldn't understand much of it, but he was very proud. And so that just made me feel like, I finally listened to him.
Beautiful. Thank you. Greg, last word.
Yeah, it would be very much the same. A long line of blessings from amazing teachers. And it goes all the way to contemporary times. Working with Henry Louis Gates Jr. for a number of years on this project, no greater gift. He read every single word, and I don't know how he has the time to do the sort of mentorship he does, and I'm just one of many. But this just, it goes down a line. There's Jill McCorkle, who was my creative writing teacher at Chapel Hill. We can go into my high school at Charlotte Catholic, and I'm just going to trace this back to Mrs. Cups, who was my first grade teacher. I remember this because I do this when I'm teaching writing to students because it meant everything to me. What she would do on my first papers, attempting to write simple stories and sentences, she would put a sticker. It was a scratch and sniff fruit sticker. And the deepest memory I have is just the joy and the pleasure to not get a paper with marking things out. There would be fruit that I would scratch and sniff. And in this way, I always thought that writing and editing was a type of nourishing, warm, caring thing. And my entire career as a writer is following that response that has encouraged me to continue to do. So when I teach writing, I spend a lot of time drawing fruit in the margins of my students' papers, just because it's that drive, that gift that our teachers are giving us to to encourage us to do. It's very hard to write. We finish books, and then we're all talking about what our next books are, and how we're all struggling on our next books, right? So that sort of long line of encouragement, starting with Mrs. Cups and her scratch and sniff stickers.
Well, each of you has given us that encouragement. Each of you has given us that scratch and sniff moment of the sheer joy of brilliant writing, of caring writing, of passionate writing, of joyful writing, permit me, of redemptive writing in a time that is dearly, dearly in need of redemption, not just as individuals, but for our society to be sure. We are delighted to honor all of you tonight. Thank you for being with us.